The phone was ringing when I walked through the front door, still wearing my coat. I almost didn't answer it. I wish I hadn't. It was my neighbor Margaret, the retired school teacher who lives 3 houses down from my son's place in Barrie. She said she hadn't seen anyone come or go from the house in over a week. She said the mail was piling up on the porch. She said she knocked twice and got no answer, and something about the whole situation made her uneasy enough to find my number through my son's wife. I told her I was sure everything was fine. I wasn't sure at all. My son, I'll call him by what I've always called him, just my son, because that's all he is to me now. That relationship, that word had stopped returning my calls 6 weeks earlier. Not gradually. Not the slow drift you sometimes get with grown children who get busy, who get caught up in their own lives. It stopped all at once, like a switch had been flipped. One week we were talking every Sunday evening the way we always had, the way his mother and I had made a habit of since he moved to Barrie with his wife and their 2 kids. The next week, nothing. Voicemail, then voicemail again, then a text that said, "Only busy, we'll call soon," and never did. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years working as a property assessor for the city of Toronto before I retired. I am not a man who panics easily. I am not a man who assumes the worst. My wife, God rest her, used to say that was my greatest flaw, that I always gave people more credit than they deserved, that I trusted too completely, that I couldn't imagine cruelty because I didn't have any in me to recognize it in others. She was right. I know that now. After Margaret's call, I sat in my kitchen in Mississauga for a long time without turning on the lights. The November dark came in early, the way it does in Ontario. I thought about the last time I'd seen my son in person Thanksgiving weekend. At my place, turkey and stuffing, and his wife making her cranberry sauce that was always too sweet. The kids running around the backyard even though it was cold. Everything normal. Everything exactly as it should be. And then the silence. I called my son's wife's cell phone, went straight to voicemail. I called the house line. They still had a landline. One of the few younger families I know who kept one, and it rang 8 times before I hung up. I called my son's work number, the general line at the contracting firm where he'd worked for 11 years, and the woman who answered told me he'd taken an extended leave of absence and they couldn't share any further details. Extended leave of absence. I drove to Barrie the next morning, left Mississauga at 6:15, before the 400 got bad. I had a key my son had given me a copy years ago, for emergencies. I remember the day he gave it to me. He pressed it into my hand and said, "You're always welcome, Dad. Anytime." I kept it on my keychain all these years. I'd never used it. The house looked normal from the street. The mail Margaret mentioned had been cleared, or maybe I'd caught it on a better day. My son's truck was in the driveway. His wife's SUV was gone. The curtains were drawn in the front windows, which wasn't unusual for that time of morning in November. I knocked. I waited. I knocked again. Harder. Nothing. I used the key. The house had a smell I noticed immediately. Stale air, like windows hadn't been opened in weeks. Coffee cups on the counter. A cereal bowl in the sink with residue dried hard around the rim. Boots piled by the door. The television was off. The kids' backpacks were gone, which I registered only later as significant. I called out. My son's name. My daughter-in-law's name. The kids' names. Silence. I walked through the kitchen, into the living room. Everything in its place but covered in the thin film of a house that hadn't been properly lived in for some time. A thin layer of dust on the glass coffee table. A plant on the windowsill that had gone brown and brittle. Then I heard it. It was faint enough that I thought at first I'd imagined it. A sound from above, from the second floor, or beyond it. A slow, rhythmic knocking. Deliberate, like someone trying to be heard without being too loud. I stood completely still in the middle of that living room, and I listened. There it was again. Knock, 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 pause, knock, 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 knock. I went up the stairs. The second-floor hallway had 3 doors, the kids' rooms and the master bedroom at the end. I checked all 3. Empty, beds made, no one. I was about to go back downstairs and call the police when I noticed the panel in the ceiling at the end of the hallway. The attic hatch. There was a lock on it, not the small decorative kind, not a latch, a padlock, a serious one, the kind you'd put on a storage unit or a garage door, bolted to a hasp that had been installed on the frame of the hatch, screwed in with hardware I didn't recognize from home. It had been put there intentionally. I stood underneath it and I said, loudly and as steadily as I could manage, "Is someone up there?" A sound came back, not words. A sound that I will not describe in detail because I don't have words for it that don't feel inadequate, except to say that it was human and it was desperate and it was the voice of someone who had been waiting for a very long time to be found. My hands were shaking when I called 911. I told them there was someone locked in the attic of the house. I gave them the address. I told them to hurry. The dispatcher told me not to break down the hatch myself, and I told her I understood, and then I immediately went to the garage and found a crowbar in my son's toolbox and broke down the hatch myself. The ladder unfolded down. I climbed up. The attic was insulated but not heated. There was a single extension cord running from somewhere below, powering a small space heater and a lamp. There was a cot, a camping cot, the cheap folding kind pushed against the far wall. There were water bottles, a case of them most empty. There were crackers, granola bars, a small cooler. There was a bucket in the corner that I turned away from immediately. And there was my daughter-in-law's mother. Her name is Patricia. She is 71 years old. She was sitting on the cot with her back against the insulation bats, her knees drawn up, wearing 2 sweaters and a pair of track pants that were too large for her. Her hair was unwashed and her face was thinner than I'd ever seen it, and her eyes, when they found mine in the lamplight, had a look in them that I cannot get out of my head. Not fear, past fear. The flat, stunned look of someone who had accepted something and was surviving it 1 hour at a time. I said her name. She said, "I knew someone would come. I kept telling myself someone would come." I had to sit down on the attic floor because my legs stopped working properly. I'd known Patricia for 11 years, since before my son married her daughter. She was a widow, same as I am. Her husband gone 8 years ago from a heart attack. She'd sold her house in Sudbury 2 years back and moved into an apartment in Barrie to be closer to her grandchildren. She was a quiet woman, careful with her words, always brought butter tarts to family gatherings because she knew they were my son's favorite. She told me, while we waited for the ambulance, while I sat on that attic floor holding her hands because she was shaking, and I think I was too, what had happened over the past 6 weeks. Her daughter, my daughter-in-law, had come to her apartment in September and told her there was mold in the building, that it wasn't safe, that she and my son wanted her to stay with them temporarily while it was dealt with. Patricia had been grateful. She'd packed a bag, come to the house, slept in the guest room. 2 weeks later, her apartment was apparently sold. Not by her. Without her knowledge. Her daughter had power of attorney. Patricia had signed it 2 years ago, after a minor health scare, because her daughter asked her to, and she trusted her daughter completely. Using that power of attorney, her daughter had listed the apartment, accepted an offer, and completed the sale. The proceeds, roughly $340,000 from a condo in Barrie in that market, had been transferred to an account Patricia had never heard of. When Patricia found out, when she confronted her daughter, the conversation ended with Patricia being moved from the guest room to the attic. They told her it was temporary. They said there were complications. They said she needed to be patient. They took her phone. They told the children, Patricia's own grandchildren, 8 and 10 years old, that Grandma Patricia wasn't feeling well and needed rest and not to bother her. The kids had been sent to stay with my son's wife's friend in Aurelia. The house was quiet. The neighbors saw nothing unusual. And my daughter-in-law and my son drove to their lawyer's office and began the process of having Patricia declared mentally incompetent, which would have given them permanent control over her remaining assets, her RRSP, her survivor pension from her late husband's employer, a small inheritance she'd been holding from her own mother. Combined, just over $180,000. The ambulance came. Then 2 OPP cruisers. Then a detective who asked me to wait downstairs while they spoke with Patricia, and I sat in my son's kitchen in the home I'd helped him with the down payment on 12 years ago, and I tried to understand what I was sitting inside. My son's cell phone was tracked within 4 hours. He and his wife were at a hotel in Vaughan. I don't know what they thought they were doing, whether they planned to come back, whether they thought Patricia would simply wait indefinitely, whether they thought no one would ever come to check. The detective told me later that in his experience, people who do things like this don't think that far ahead. They think about what they want, and they take it, and they deal with consequences when consequences arrive. Consequences arrived. My son was arrested at the hotel. His wife was arrested at the same time. They were both charged under the Criminal Code forcible confinement, fraud over $5,000, breach of fiduciary duty. In Ontario, abuse of power of attorney for financial gain is a serious matter. Their lawyer entered not guilty pleas at the bail hearing. The judge denied bail for my daughter-in-law. My son was released on strict conditions, including that he have no contact with Patricia. I drove back to Mississauga that night in the dark on the 400, and I didn't turn on the radio. I needed the quiet. I needed to hear myself think, except that I couldn't really think yet. I could only feel the weight of what I'd learned, settling over everything like snow, slow, and thorough, and covering all the familiar shapes, until nothing looked the way I remembered it. I've gone over it so many times in the weeks since. The Thanksgiving dinner, the phone calls, the key on my keychain, the moment I stood at the bottom of the attic ladder with a crowbar in my hands, trying to hold myself steady enough to climb. I think about what would have happened if Margaret hadn't called me, if the mail hadn't piled up, if Patricia had stopped knocking. I can't stay in that thought too long. Patricia spent 4 days in Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre in Barrie. She was dehydrated, malnourished, had developed a respiratory infection from the cold and the poor ventilation in the attic. She'd lost 14 pounds in 6 weeks. She had bruising on her wrists from where she'd been physically restrained on 2 occasions when she tried to climb down from the attic herself. The doctor told me, carefully and professionally, that another 2 weeks in those conditions might have had a very different outcome. She's staying with me now, in Mississauga, the spare room. She has her own bathroom, and I bought her a small television, and she can come and go as she likes. I have to say that to her sometimes. You can come and go as you like, Patricia. The door is not locked. You are not locked in. She's working with a social worker and a psychologist through the county health services. She has good days and harder days. Last Tuesday, she baked butter tarts, stood in my kitchen for 2 hours in her cardigan, and when she slid the pan out of the oven, she started crying and couldn't explain why. And I sat with her at the table until she was ready to talk, and then we talked for a long time. I've been doing a lot of things that needed to be done, practically. I retained a lawyer to help Patricia pursue civil recovery of the $340,000, which is a long process, but the lawyer says the evidence is strong. The power of attorney has been formally revoked. Her survivor pension and her RRSP are protected. Her daughter never completed those transfers, whether because she ran out of time or lost her nerve at the last moment. I don't know, and I've stopped trying to understand the logic inside it. The criminal case is ongoing. I won't know the outcome for some time. I've been told not to discuss certain details publicly, and I won't. What I will say is that the Crown prosecutor told me what they did to Patricia is taken seriously in this province, and that he intends to make sure that is reflected in the outcome. I haven't spoken to my son since the night he was arrested. He left a voicemail 2 weeks later, one of the permitted contacts through his bail conditions. I listened to it once. He said he was sorry. He said things had gotten out of hand. He said he hoped I could understand someday. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. He's my son. I taught him to ride his bike in the parking lot of our church in Scarborough. I drove him to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning every Saturday for 6 years. I stood beside him at the altar when he married the woman who is now facing criminal charges for locking her own mother in an unheated attic for 6 weeks. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with any of it. What I know is this. Patricia is in my spare room. She asked me last week if she could plant something in the backyard, come spring, maybe tomatoes, maybe some herbs. I said, of course. I said we'd go to the garden center together when the weather turned and she could pick whatever she wanted. I know that the key I carry on my keychain, the one my son gave me, the one he said meant I was always welcome, is still there. I haven't taken it off. I don't know why. Maybe because removing it feels like deciding something I'm not ready to decide yet. I know that Margaret, my son's neighbor in Barrie, called me last week to ask how everything was. We talked for almost an hour. She said she'd been worried when she didn't see any lights on at the house. She said something felt wrong and she couldn't explain it. I told her that her instinct saved a woman's life, and there was a long silence on the phone. And then she said she was just glad she called. Suanli, if you are watching this and you have an elderly parent or relative, a mother, a father, an aunt, a grandmother, and something feels off, and you can't explain it, and you've told yourself twice that it's probably nothing, please don't wait. Please don't give it another week. Please don't assume the best just because assuming the best is easier. Make the call. Drive the distance. Use the key. I almost didn't. I spent a night talking myself out of it, listing all the reasonable explanations, telling myself I was being intrusive, telling myself he was a grown man, telling myself everything was probably fine. Everything was not fine. It hasn't been fine for a long time, apparently, and I didn't see it, and I have to live inside that knowledge now, alongside everything else. But Patricia is in my kitchen this morning, and the coffee is on, and when I came downstairs she looked up at me from the table and said, "Good morning." And I said, "Good morning" back, and outside the window the January is very cold and very white, and we are both still here. That's what I have. Some mornings, that has to be enough. If this story reached something in you, I'd like to hear from you. Leave a comment below, share your experience, your thoughts, or just let me know where you're watching from. And if you know someone who might need to hear this today, please share it with them.